So I am a statistician, and I usually start my talks by doing a quick survey of the crowd and finding out, have we got any other statisticians or budding statisticians in the audience? Okay, we've got quite a few actually. Although for those of you who aren't, how many of you like statistics? That's actually the best response I've ever had. I get actually a lot of mathematicians telling me that they hate stats and it was their worst bit of stats. But I'm going to talk to you today about risk, amongst other things. And I thought I'd start out by just finding out how good an understanding do you guys have of risk. So I'm going to show you some risky activities, and I'm going to ask you which is the more risky out of the two. So which causes more deaths annually? Is it crocodiles or is it hippos? So I think we'll do cheers. So give me a cheer if you think it's a crocodile. And give me a cheer if you think it's the hippo. It's overwhelmingly in favour of the hippo. I can tell you guys it's not looking good. So crocodiles are 1,000 deaths a year, whereas hippos are 500 according to the World Health Organization. So yeah, your understanding of risk isn't that good. Let's try another one. So which causes more accidents, baseball or cheerleading? Can we cheer if you think it's baseball? And cheer if you think it's cheerleading? That one is cheerleading. So we're starting to get a little bit better. So 16 versus 20 per 100,000 participants. And finally, which is the more dangerous mode of transport? Cycling or in a car? So give me a cheer if you think it's cycling. And cheer if you think it's a car. That's probably a little bit more like 50-50, but actually cycling is a lot more dangerous than cars. So 550 deaths versus 130 per billion hours. And there's lots of discussions that you could have over what is the appropriate way to try and communicate risks such as these. And that's something that we could maybe talk about. But yeah, that's the way that I've chosen to communicate it. And cycling comes out worse than cars. But when I talk about stats in my talks, I like to talk about risks and stats that we see every single day, because we're presented actually with statistics every single day in newspapers. So, you know, night owls risk early death, excess drinking takes years off your life, concussion, increase in Parkinson's disease, dementia, so sitting too long can increase your risk of dementia. We're told, you know, you shouldn't take painkillers because they double the risk of heart attacks and strokes. Children shouldn't have CT scans because they increase their risk of brain cancer, and HRT doubles the risk of ovarian cancer. We're bombarded every single day with these headlines and these numbers and these statistics, and we're expected to use these to be able to make decisions about our everyday lives. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just trying to unpack some of these headlines and kind of equip you with the sort of tools that you might need to be able to question these headlines and these stats that you see every single day. And I thought we'd start out by considering the humble bacon sandwich. Now, bacon comes up all the time as being really bad for us. You know, cancer risk higher, eating 2 rations of bacon increases your risk of stomach cancer. A daily fry-up can boost your cancer risk by 20%. Now, that's quite a shocking statistic. And when stats like these actually come out, you know, sales of bacon do actually plummet sometimes. I get a lot of people saying to me, you know, is this something that I actually need to be worried about? Do I need to stop eating bacon? So what does a headline like this actually mean? I thought we could have a look and say, okay, what is the numbers behind this headline? So I should say that this was actually looking at pancreatic cancer, sorry. So what are your chances of getting pancreatic cancer just generally? And according to Cancer Research UK, we have a 1 in 80 lifetime risk of pancreatic cancer. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means if we were to take 400 individuals who didn't eat bacon, we would expect 5 of them to get pancreatic cancer anyway. So then if we have a look back at our headline, well, that said that our daily fry-up boosts our cancer risk by 20%. or a fifth? Now, this is a room full of mathematicians. What is a fifth of 5? We can see that actually our daily fry-up boosting our cancer risk by 20% means we go from 5 in every 400 people to 6 in every 400 people. So it's only an extra 1 person in every 400 that would be at an increased risk of, that would get pancreatic cancer, from eating bacon every day compared to those who never ate it. Now, when these headlines came out, there were also headlines saying that bacon, ham and sausages were now as big a cancer threat as smoking, the World Health Organization to warn. Now, the background story to this headline is that the WHO every year produces these lists of things that definitely do cause cancer. And smoking had been known there for lung cancer for very many years. And for the first time ever, this processed meat was being added to this list of, yes, this definitely does cause cancer. Because these were now both on this list, the headline was saying that they were now as risky as each other. Now, these lists aren't actually based on the risks associated with these. They're actually just based on statistical significance. And I'm going to talk a little bit about statistical significance later on in my talk. But just briefly, what statistical significance does is it tells us whether or not something does actually have an effect. But it doesn't quantify it in any way. Just does it increase cancer or not? And if it does, it goes on this list. It can increase it by a tiny amount, or it can increase it by a huge amount. If it definitely does cause an increased risk of cancer, it goes on this list. So what are the risks for smoking and lung cancer? How do they compare to the risks that we've just seen for bacon and pancreatic cancer? Well, if you were to take our 400 individuals again, and we were to say, okay, how many of these would get lung cancer if none of them smoked? Well, that's 4. So you'd expect 4 in every 400 to get lung cancer without smoking. If you smoke 25 or more cigarettes every single day, that actually goes up 24 times to 96 in every 400 people. So it's an extra 92 in every 400 who would get lung cancer from smoking. So yes, both of these things may be statistically significant in causing an increased risk of cancer. But to say that they are as risky as each other is probably pushing it a little bit. And a lot of the time what you see in these headlines is that it compares the two extremes and tries to then use it as a justification for never ever doing this activity. You know, that compared people who never ate bacon with those who ate it every single day. And even in that comparison, it was only an extra 1 in every 400 people. You think about all those individuals, you know, that like to have a bacon sandwich on a Saturday morning for a treat. That's going to have an even smaller effect on your risk of pancreatic cancer. And another thing that you need to think about is the fact that those people who eat bacon every single day for breakfast, well, they're not eating fruit for breakfast every day. They may be more likely to just have an unhealthy lifestyle in general. And how do we know that it's the bacon that's actually causing this increased risk in cancer and that it isn't one of these other factors instead? So in statistics, we talk about these correlation causation arguments. And some of my favourite headlines for this is that drinking 1 kind of fizzy drink a day will make teenagers behave more aggressively. Fizzy drinks make teenagers violent. Children drinking fizzy drinks are regularly more likely to carry a gun. Now, it could be that drinking fizzy drinks makes teenagers a little bit violent. Or it could be that there is some other factor, you know, some social demographic factor that means that you are more likely to drink fizzy drinks and also means that you are more likely to be violent or carry a gun. Or it could be that being violent is thirsty work and at the end of it you want a fizzy drink. We don't know which way round that relationship goes. And as I said, we say that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. And one of my favourite websites to go on, if you Google spurious correlations, it's the first website that you get up, has all these weird and wonderful things that you can correlate with each other. Now, it is American-based, so a lot of them are US-based, but you can correlate the number of Nicolas Cage movies with all these weird and wonderful things. And I picked out some of my favourites, and we can see that there is a 95% correlation between sugar consumption and the divorce rate in Florida. So does that mean, if you avoid sugar, you won't get divorced? Who knows? There is a 99% correlation between revenue generated by arcades and the number of computer science doctorates awarded. So I don't know what that means about how much computer scientists liked spending money in arcades. But my absolute favourite is that there is a 95% correlation between the per capita consumption of cheese and the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their beds. So does this mean that we shouldn't eat cheese before we go to bed because we might die? No, it doesn't. These are two things that just happen to be correlated with each other, and it doesn't mean that one is causing the other. One of the best examples of this that we see a lot is that as ice cream sales go up, so do the number of drownings. So does this mean we shouldn't eat ice cream before we go in the sea because we might drown? No, it doesn't. It might look like there's actually a relationship between the two. But there's one thing that drives both of these things, and that's the weather. As the temperatures increase and we get hot weather, we are more likely to eat ice cream and we are more likely to go in the sea, meaning that there just are more drownings because there are more people in the sea. And if we ignore that fact, it can look like the ice cream is causing drownings. Whereas actually, if we then account for this hot weather, that relationship disappears. And we can actually see that it's this hot weather that's actually driving these two things. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but when I see a headline such as fizzy drinks make teenagers carry guns, I kind of can use my common sense and say there's maybe something else going on there. But there was a story in the BBC last January, which I commented on, which said that dementia rates were higher near busy roads. So living near a busy road increased your risk of dementia by 7%. And so I was asked to talk about that 7% increase and what did that actually mean. And it was quite small numbers. But I went and looked at the paper, which was in The Lancet. And I thought that there was an even bigger issue, which was completely ignored. And that was the fact that they didn't control for a family history when they carried out this analysis. And my argument was that actually, dementia has a huge family history element to it. That is one of the big causes is genetic element. And I said that there was an argument for saying that actually there might be a family history kind of element as to where people live. And that if you grow up in big cities, you might be more likely to carry on living in big cities when you yourself become an adult. If you grow up in the countryside, you might be more likely to live in the countryside yourself as an adult. And so by ignoring this fact, how do we know that it's the busy road that's causing this dementia and it isn't actually instead this genetic element that could actually be feeding in to both of these things? Another thing that I noticed when I looked at this paper in more detail, though, was I looked at the supplementary material. And they chose to present that living near a busy road increased your risk of dementia by 7%. But they chose to ignore all of these other things that have an even bigger effect on your risk of dementia. So if you look to the supplementary material, here are the other things that they actually tested for. And we can see that actually dementia smoking increases your risk of dementia by 30%. Obesity increases your risk of dementia by 64%. Having a low education status compared to a high education status increases your risk of dementia by 59%. And yet it was this 7% increase was the thing that they chose to focus all of their attention on. And I said, before you start thinking about picking up sticks and moving to the countryside, there are other things that you can actually think about that have more of an effect. And I think sometimes headlines do this, and sometimes newspaper articles do this. They choose this thing that's shocking, and they choose to report that, and they don't necessarily give you the whole picture. They're not necessarily telling you everything else that might be going on. Okay, so I think my next slide is a video, and I want to move on to talk about something that really annoys, I think, a lot of people. So I'm going to just give this a go and hope that I know which is the next slide. Yes.
Pearl Drops cleans. Pearl Drops whitens. Pearl Drops protects. Pearl Drops shines. Pearl Drops 4D whitening system not only whitens but cleans, shines and protects too. Ultimate whitening up to 4 shades whiter in just 3 weeks. Pearl Drops tooth polish. Go beyond whitening.
It's not just newspapers that really annoy me for bad stats, it's adverts as well. Now, you may have spotted in that advert, you get a stat up at the bottom like this, and they happen all the time, that so many percent of so many people agree with some statement that you've got no idea what it is. And I get asked all the time, you know, can we actually, you know, have got any confidence in these numbers that are presented? And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about statistical significance and uncertainty. So a lot of people know that in general a small sample size isn't great when you're doing your surveys. But why do we actually need to worry about sample sizes? What are the consequences of small sample sizes? What does that mean for statistical significance and uncertainty when we're presented with statistics like this? And I'm just going to switch a little bit and move into the medical world, because that's where I work. So I work in clinical trial research. And I'm going to say, let's pretend we were running a clinical trial and we were comparing paracetamol to some placebo, looking at whether or not it took your headaches away. And let's say we had 100 people in each group, and we saw 60% recovering in the placebo group and 65% recovering in our paracetamol group. And these are the kind of stats that I would see on a daily basis in clinical trials. And it would be up to me to then decide whether or not I think paracetamol is better than placebo. Now, one of the major things that we need to consider when we're thinking about this is uncertainty. Now, what do I mean by uncertainty? If you were to think about flipping a coin, so if I had, and I do this when I'm doing it to kids, I get 10 of them up here and I give them a coin each, and I get them all to flip a coin 10 times, and I get them to count how many heads they get. Now, we know that they've got a fair coin. We know that there's a 50-50 chance of a head or a tail. So theoretically, you would expect to see 5 heads and 5 tails. But that's not what we see in practice. Sometimes we might see 3 heads, sometimes we might see 7 heads. So when we actually run experiments with this, we collect this data that is noisy and subject to uncertainty. So in statistics, we have these 2 sorts of main areas, probability theory and statistical inference. So in probability theory, I know what the underlying probability is. So in the case of the coins, I know that I've got a 50-50 chance of a head or a tail. But I see noisy data when I run experiments using those coins. Now in statistical inference, what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to go the other way. And we have this data that we've collected that we know is noisy and is subject to uncertainty. And we've got to try and use that to tell us something about what the underlying probability is. So when we think about my clinical trial, I had 100 people in each group and I saw 60 and 65% of people recovering. If I'd taken a different 200 people, I wouldn't have necessarily seen exactly those same numbers. I'd have probably seen something slightly different. A different 200 people would give me something slightly different again. So I know that any data that I collect is going to be noisy and subject to uncertainty, but I have to try and use that to tell me something about the underlying probabilities. So when I run my clinical trial, I'm not interested really in whether or not 60 is different from 65, because it obviously is. But that 60 and that 65 represent some unobserved underlying chance of headache recovery, and it's that I'm interested in. Are those different from each other? Are my underlying chances of recovery in each of the treatment groups actually different from one another? And sample sizes is something that I can control to try and improve on the amount of uncertainty that I have. So in general, the bigger the sample size, the less uncertainty I have, and the more confidence that I have in the numbers that I see when I actually run my experiments. But small sample sizes don't necessarily always have to be a bad thing. And I've got a little demonstration to show you what I mean by that. So I run some computer simulations of dice. Now, there are some dice lying around. This isn't for this bit. So if you've got a dice, if you came back and there was a dice underneath your seat, just hold it for later. That's not for this bit. But this is another one. So I've run some computer simulations of some fair dice and some biased dice. And we are a room of mathematicians. I don't need to tell you that if it's a fair dice, you've got a probability of 1 in 6 of getting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, meaning that as I roll that dice lots of times, I should expect to see about the same number of 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s coming out. And if I saw loads of one number or too few of another number, then I might have reason to believe that maybe my dice is biased. So I'm going to show you what these simulations look like after a certain number of rolls, and I'm going to ask you if you think that they are fair or biased dice. So we do have some more audience participation. So this is what it looked like. The first one looked like after 10 rolls, 20, 50, and 100. So I think what I'm going to get you to do is I'm going to get everybody to just stand up for me. So we could just stand up. If you think that this is a fair dice, then I'd like you to sit back down. If you think that this is a biased dice, I would like you to stay standing. So sit down if you think it's a fair, stay standing if you think it's a biased. Okay, I can kind of see either side. Okay, I think you're about 50-50-ish actually. So those of you who are standing and you think it's biased, in what way do you think it's biased?
3.
3, you think there's too few of 3. Okay, you can sit back down. And I can tell you that this one is a biased dice, but it's actually not biased in the way that you thought. It's that number 6 that's actually got a probability of 2 in 7 compared to a probability of 1 in 7 for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if I take that up to 1,000 rolls, we can see that pattern emerging. That number 6 is now twice as big as all of the other ones, which have kind of started to level off. Okay, so we've got 2 more that I'm going to whiz through very quickly. So 10, 20, 50, and 100. I'll just get you to stick your hands up or down this time. So it was up for bias, down for fair. What do we think? So up for bias, down for fair. Okay, we've got a few people. I can tell you that this one is actually a fair dice. And again, if we take up to 1,000 rolls, we can see that they're all starting to level off. And the last one, we've got 10, 20, 50, and 100. So what do we think? Up for bias, down for fair. And in what way do you think it's biased? 6. You all think it's number 6. So I can tell you this one is a biased dice, and it is, of course, biased in favour of number 6. But it is also biased in favour of 1 and 3. And this last one is a really nice example of the interplay between sample sizes and treatment effect sizes. So because 4 and 11 is quite different from 1 and 11 and 2 and 11, I don't actually need a very big sample size to be able to say that there's something going on with that. So if we look, okay, so 20 you can't really see there's anything going on, but by 50 rolls I can already see that there's something going on with that number 6. Now, as I said, the bigger the sample size, the smaller the uncertainty. So if you think about, you've got 2 probabilities, the underlying probabilities are really far away from each other. If I've got a very, very small sample size and I take repeated samples, I'm going to see that they're going to bounce around that underlying unobserved probability. And I'm going to see them bouncing around. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty if I have a very small sample size. But if those probabilities are really far apart from each other, it kind of doesn't matter if there's a lot of uncertainty. It doesn't really matter if they're bouncing around quite a lot. If all I'm interested in is whether or not there's a difference between the two, I can kind of see that there is a difference between the two. If, on the other hand, those probabilities are closer together, so we've got our 1 in 11 compared to that 2 in 11, those probabilities are closer together, and I have a small sample size, and I have lots of uncertainty on that, it's going to make it more difficult for me to be able to say that actually there's a difference between the two. So what I need to do is I need to increase my sample size to reduce the amount of uncertainty, which would then allow me to say that actually, yes, the underlying probabilities between these two are different from each other. And in fact, if I then take this one up to 1,000 rolls, I can see that 1 and 3, being a higher probability than the 2, 4, and the 5. Now, when we go back to our clinical trial, and we've got our 100 people in each group, there is a formal test that I can carry out which takes into account the sample sizes, the amount of uncertainty and things like that. And it's a hypothesis test. And what my hypothesis test does is it thinks about two hypotheses, a null and an alternative. My null hypothesis says, well, let's assume that the underlying probability of recovery in each of these treatment groups is exactly the same. So let's assume there is no difference between these two groups. I can then calculate what's called a p-value, which tells me what is the chances of seeing this result if the two were exactly the same. So what is the chance, or the p-value, the probability of me seeing 60% and 65% of people recovering if actually there is no difference between these two groups and they're exactly the same? And if that p-value is quite high, that means I've got quite a high chance of seeing this, even if the two are exactly the same. I haven't got enough evidence to say that there's a difference between the two. If that p-value, on the other hand, is very, very small, well, then I'm saying the probability of seeing this, if the two are exactly the same, is really small. So maybe the two aren't the same, and maybe my paracetamol group is doing better than my placebo group. So what is the p-value in this instance? It magically appears. It's 0.47, so 47%. So I've got 47% chance of seeing this, even if the two are exactly the same. So I don't really have enough evidence there to say that paracetamol is performing any better than placebo. If, though, instead of having 100 people in each group, I now had 1,000 people in each group, and I saw exactly the same result, because my sample size is bigger, I've got less uncertainty on these numbers, and they're more likely to be closer to what the true underlying chances of recovery are. And actually, my chances of seeing this, if the two are exactly the same, is 2%. And so in this instance, I would have enough evidence to say that my paracetamol group seems to be doing better than my placebo. If I go back to my 60% recovering in placebo, but I have 100 people in each group again, but 75% of people recovering in my paracetamol group, well, now I've still got a small sample size, I've still got uncertainty on that. But because 75 is a lot further away from 60, it kind of doesn't matter that there's more uncertainty on it. And actually, I've still got a 2% chance of seeing this if the two were the same. I've still got enough evidence to say that actually there seems to be a difference between these two groups. So when we go back to our advert, and we had 52% of 52 people agreed. Now, in this instance, you have to think of this, and it's quite difficult to get your head around. Sometimes I have to double think this. Your null hypothesis in this instance would be that 50% of people agreed. Because you have to think about it, if someone had a choice, do you agree with whatever statement? Yes or no. The null hypothesis would just be choosing them just by chance. So you would expect about half to say yes and about half to say no. So the null hypothesis that we're testing here is 50%. So we're testing how different is 52% from 50% if we've only asked 52 people. And we can calculate a p-value for this. And it turns out to be 77%. There's got a 77% chance of seeing this just by chance. So it's not statistically significantly different from pure chance. But I think we could probably look at this and say, we could probably look at that, eyeball it and say that's absolute nonsense. There's another one here that said that 74% of 54 men agreed with some of the statement. Agree with what is one of the other things that really annoys me about it, but that's a whole other story. So again, but it's 54 people, so it's not that much different from our 52 people that we saw before. But so does that mean we should rubbish it instantly? Does that mean that because there's only 50-odd people been asked that it's therefore rubbish research and we shouldn't consider that result? Well, because we've got 74% of people now agreeing, and that's further away from our 50%, our p-value on this is tiny. And here we've got enough evidence to say that there is a difference, that this is actually statistically significantly different from just pure randomness. But my argument is that actually statistical significance is only one part of the story, and this is just a point estimate. And as I said, if you took a different 54 people, we would get different results. So theoretically, what results could we expect to get with 54 people? If we put a 95% confidence interval in this, so this means that if we were to take 100 lots of 54 people and repeated this same thing, we would expect 95 of them to get point estimates between 60 and 85. And that's quite a big range, actually. You're only presenting this point estimate, but the uncertainty on that is actually really quite big. And I think uncertainty is something that a lot of people really struggle to get their head around. And I don't think that it necessarily has to be that complicated, though. So I was thinking about where else do we tend to see point estimates? And if you go on the Met Office, if you go on BBC Weather, they've now started including point estimates for your chance of rain. Now, I used an old one rather than this week, because this week's wouldn't have been that entertaining. So this was from Thursday the 24th of some month, a couple of months ago. And it was in Oxford, which is where I live. And it was saying that at particular points in the day, you had these ridiculously specific chances of rain. So what have we got here? At 3 o'clock, your chance of rain is 51%, whereas at 4 o'clock, it's 53%. These terribly precise point estimates of your chance of rain. But actually, that in itself isn't really that useful, because we don't know what the uncertainty is on that. I mean, that could be a really accurate prediction, or theoretically, it could range somewhere between, 10 and 80%. Without knowing what the uncertainty is on that, how are we supposed to know how much confidence we have in these numbers? And I don't think communicating uncertainty necessarily has to be really complicated. I think people do understand plots, such as bar charts, with then uncertainty communicated on them. I don't think it necessarily has to be a really difficult thing. Graphics can communicate actually quite a lot of complicated statistics and complicated data, I think, in a very easy way. They can, of course, do great evil also, and I would like to just share some of my favourite bad graphics. So this, a lot of people might have seen this one. This does the rounds quite a lot. So this is obviously a bad use of a pie chart. This is in 2012 presidential run. This is another really bad pie chart, where I don't quite understand how if 51% of people have used marijuana today, then only 34 of them have used it since 1997. Because today is since 1997. So I actually have no idea how they got to the figures that are on there. Forget about the fact that the pie chart's a pie chart isn't what you should have used to communicate this. So yeah, I have no idea how that's supposed to be helpful. This is a chart from the Office of National Statistics, choosing their scale very carefully to make a 0.1% increase look a lot bigger than it actually is. And that's a little bit sneaky. You tend to see this quite a lot, actually. If you look at graphics, always look at the scale on the axes, because you can tell very different stories by how much you zoom in or zoom out on a graphic. And then this one is from Ben & Jerry's, who did a survey on people's favourite ways of producing energy. And they seem to think that 61% is bigger than 62%. And their 24% seems to be a lot smaller than their 21% as well. I think this is a clear case of where Ben & Jerry's wanted to tell a particular story and are using the graphics to try and tell that story, and hoping that you'll just look at the pictures and not actually read the numbers, which is very, very sneaky. But yeah, graphics can be used to do great good, but they can be used for great evil as well. So I want to move back to newspapers, and I want to talk a little bit more about uncertainty and variability. And I want to talk about a story that I was asked about at the beginning of this year, which said that last year was the safest year in history for commercial airlines, as there were no passenger jet crashes anywhere. There were no deaths whatsoever. And just as a little comparison, there were 39 selfie deaths last year. And you might be asking yourself, what is a selfie death? It's all the stupid things that people do in order to take the ultimate selfie. And this is actually so much of an issue that the Russian government has a safe selfie campaign where they produce leaflets telling you all the things that you shouldn't do whilst taking selfies. Some of these may seem really obvious, like this guy with the gun. But there have been cases of people in America and other places of trying to take a selfie with a gun at their head, accidentally shooting the gun and killing themselves. So whilst it may seem like obvious advice, people are doing stupid things in order to take the ultimate selfie. And we had 39 selfie deaths last year, compared with none in passenger jets. And so at the beginning of the year, I was asked, does this mean that 2017 was the safest year in history? This year we have actually had passenger jet crashes. So does that mean that our best year has been and gone? And that's it now, we're all doomed and things can only get worse from here. I talked about something then called regression to the mean. And this is where if you had a dice underneath your chair or around you, this is where you will need it. So can you just stick your hands up? If you can see a dice that isn't with someone as well and you would like to be involved. Sorry, I don't have that many, so and I've tried to spread them out. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a demonstration to show you what I mean by this regression to the mean. And I'm going to use speed cameras as my example. And I'm going to say that all of you with dice are members of a town and you are worried about the number of accidents that are happening. And I'm going to give you some speed cameras. But we can't put speed cameras everywhere. So we need to have some sort of sensible strategy as to where we're going to put these speed cameras. And a sensible thing to do might be to have a look at the number of accidents, see where they're happening, identify the accident hotspots, and put the speed cameras in there. And that's what the government did when they sort of brought in these speed cameras. And we're going to recreate that now. So if you've got your dice, what I'm going to ask you to do in a second is I'm going to ask you to, as easily as you can, roll it for me twice. So it might be better to just give it a good shake in your hand and drop it on the floor. Roll it for me twice and count up how many you've got. So you can all do that for me now. And this is the point where I realised I forgot to bring contact lenses with me. And so you're all a bit fuzzy at the back. But did anybody get 12? Anybody get 11? Okay, anybody get 10? We've got 1. Okay, this is the joy of doing a probability demonstration. We're going to do that again. We're going to say that there aren't that many accidents, and I'm just going to go with it. I'm going to wing it. So let's repeat that again. Let's all give him a really good shake. Let's do it twice more. I decided there weren't any enough accidents and I've deferred a year. Right, okay, now this time. Did anybody get 12? Anybody get 11? That's 2 of you. Okay, keep your hands up for me. Did anybody get 10? Okay, I'm just going to go with the 11s. So I have some speed cameras here, which I'm going to pass out to the people who had 11. So could you just stick your hands up if you had 11? I'm going to ask, could you just pass those back to the people who've got their hands up in the air so we can identify where our speed cameras are? So we now have our speed cameras in place. And what we need to do now is we need to find out whether or not our speed cameras have worked. So once again, we're going to repeat this, and we're all going to do it again, and we're going to see whether or not our speed cameras have worked. So everybody who had a dice, even you with the speed cameras, if you want to repeat it, do exactly the same thing for me again. This is, of course, being filmed, so it is going to go disastrously wrong. We can guarantee that. Okay, those of you with the speed cameras, how did you get this time? 3. 9. So we've got 3 and 9. So we can see that where we've put our speed cameras, we've actually seen a reduction in the number of accidents, meaning that our speed cameras have worked, right?
No.
No. Of course not. You could, put your hands down. This could all be explained by something called regression to the mean. Interestingly, did anybody get 12 or 11 this time round? Yeah, a couple of you. And what did you get first time round? 9 and 5. So we can see where we haven't got the speed cameras, there's been an increase in the number of accidents. Even more justification as to why they work. So what do I mean by regression to the mean? What regression to the mean says is that we all perform according to some sort of average, but that we have these random fluctuations around it. Sometimes we have these random highs, and sometimes we have these random lows. So here I've simulated a number of accidents over a number of months, and I kept it as an average of 10 every single time. But we can see that we don't get exactly 10 accidents every single month. We see these random highs and these random lows. I could put another one on top of that, and again we see these random highs and these random lows. What regression to the mean says is that if you get something by chance that is high the first time round, the next time round you would expect it to be lower. And if you got something that was low the first time round, the next time round you'd expect it to be higher. So you didn't have a higher probability of rolling high numbers that then changed when I gave you a yellow hat. Crucially, I chose when you had a random high to then use my intervention, and I put my speed cameras in. But statistically, I would have expected them to go down anyway, regardless of whether or not I'd done anything. So if I'd chosen, say, this point in time here to put in my speed cameras, let's see if I can use my mouse instead. If I'd chosen this point here to put my speed cameras in, I'd put my speed camera here, and I would see a reduction in the number of accidents. But that's just happened just by chance. Regression to the mean tells me that I would expect to see that anyway, and it's not just that my speed cameras have been put in. But if I ignore that, it would be really easy to say, well, our speed cameras are working, especially when we look on these short-term timescales. So what we need to do when we consider whether or not things like speed cameras work is we need to look at the long-term trends. And what I said was, the passenger jet crashes. Just because we had 0 last year and we've had accidents this year doesn't mean that everything's got worse. We could just have been a random low last year, and we're just seeing it go back up to some sort of average this year. There's something called the Sports Illustrated curse that says that when you appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated, you then go on to perform really badly and you're cursed. This guy, who is Matt Harvey, the guy at the front in the middle, he appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated and went on to have the worst performance, the worst season of his career ever. Now, Sports Illustrated curse can be explained by regression to the mean. If you think about what does it take for you to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated, well, it's going to be a combination of your natural ability, but also probably riding one of these random highs. And this curse isn't really a curse, it's just you going back to what your standard ability is. If you think about when teams, whatever sports team you might support, go on a losing streak, sometimes they sack their manager, they get a new manager in and they see an increase in form and they say this is because of the new manager. That can be explained by regression to the mean. You could have just been riding one of these random lows, and actually when you chose to bring in a new manager, that increase in form isn't because a new manager's come in, but it's just you going back to what your normal is. And some research has actually shown that those teams that stick with their managers see that bounce back in form quicker than those that bring in new managers. There were some stories earlier on in the year talking about the knife crime in London and saying how London was now more dangerous than New York. Now, they looked at these really short-term trends. And, I don't want to try and trivialize what happened, and it was obviously terrible. But it is a time series that is subject to these random highs and these random lows. And BBC Reality Check did an actual investigation into it. And they found that actually, a selective use of statistics from the start of 2018 does seem to suggest that London is more dangerous than New York. But if you look at the long-term trends, then New York still appeared to be more violent than London. So, when you see these time series data and they're making conclusions based over these short periods of time, you need to ask yourself, could regression to the mean be playing a part in these random fluctuations? And think about looking at the long-term trends. Now, I want to just finish, because I think I've probably got enough time to just finish with one last example of some of the work that I did last year and this year taking on Ryanair, I guess that's one of the things that I do. So I'm one of the vice presidents of the Royal Statistical Society, and I'm the VP for External Affairs, and this was one of the big projects that I've actually been involved in. So I was contacted by Watchdog last year, and they said that they were getting all these complaints from customers who were, in the past, when they booked their, they hadn't booked their seats, when they checked into their flights, they were all seated together, and now when they were checking into their flights, they seemed to be scattered all around the plane. And Ryanair said that they allocated people randomly. If you didn't book a seat, you would be randomly allocated one anywhere throughout the plane. But everybody was complaining that they seemed to be getting middle seats. Everybody seemed to be allocated these middle seats. So Watchdog decided to investigate. So they sent 4 researchers on 4 separate flights, and on every single one of them, they were all allocated middle seats. And I was asked to come in and run the stats on that. So I said, okay, well, if their seating allocation policy is actually random, what is the chances of me seeing all 4 researchers, all 4 flights, all middle seats? So I used the data that I had. Oh, there's me in Watchdog. So I used the data that I had at the time of check-in. So they took all these snapshots for me when they checked into their flights. So I knew how many of each type of seat were available. So this was just one of them. So 23 window, 15 middle, 27 aisle, 65 in total. And then it's really straightforward to calculate what is the probability of all 4 getting middle seats using this information. We just say, okay, well, there's 15 middle to start off with from 65 in total. That's the probability that the first one randomly gets the middle seat. Then we've got 64 seats left, 14 of which are middle. So that's then the probability that the second person gets the middle seat, and so on and so on. We multiply all of these together. That gives us a probability of about 0.2%, which is 1 in 500. So a probability that all 4 researchers get middle seats on this one particular flight is 1 in 500. Which, to be honest, isn't really that surprising. If you think about how many groups of 4 people travel on Ryanair every single day, 1 in 500 of them we expect to have this. It's not really that surprising. But this just didn't happen on one flight. This happened on all 4 flights. So I did the same sort of thing for each of the other 3 flights, and I multiplied them all together, and I found out your probability of all 4 researchers, all 4 flights, all middle seats, being about 1 in 540 million. So you're more than 10 times more likely to win the national lottery than you were for this scenario to happen. And I said, okay, well, you know, small probability doesn't necessarily mean it's a rare event. How many people travel Ryanair every year? So Ryanair carries about 130 million passengers every year. So when I compared that to this probability, I was sufficiently confident in saying that maybe their allocation policy wasn't completely random, and maybe there was something else going on. Michael O'Leary maintained that he was right and that, you know, no, it was completely random. And then it was covered again by the Telegraph a few months later when a hen party, there was 15 of them, all got middle seats. And so can you calculate the probability? So all of this reared its ugly head again. And Ryanair actually then came out and admitted that they'd lied the first time round. And they had kept window and aisle seats behind because those were the seats that people were more likely to pay for. But they still did allocate randomly. So basically, you got a random row from within a middle seat. So their randomness was just the row element, but they were holding window and aisle seats and giving everybody middle seats. So I managed to get Ryanair to admit that they'd lied to their customers, but I also managed to upset them in the process because he said that he did not believe that some of the negative media coverage, which included a BBC Panorama investigation, was warranted. So not only did I get him to admit he'd lied, I got to upset him as well. But then they said, you know, has Ryanair gone back to being the bad boy of aviation? No, we haven't. And if you were to read the results of a customer satisfaction survey that came out last month, you would agree with that statement. Actually, they're not the bad boys of aviation because apparently 92% of their customers are satisfied with their flight experience and they rated them as excellent. So again, I come in and I have a look at the survey, and in the press release, this is the results of the survey. So you can see that this 92% that they're presenting, that's fine. My argument was, this is an opt-in survey, And I said, you're only ever going to opt into a survey if you're either extremely satisfied with the service or really dissatisfied with the service. Now, if you look at the options that this survey gives you, if you're dissatisfied with your Ryanair service, you've got no way whatsoever of expressing that dissatisfaction because it only goes from excellent to okay. So you're just going to say, actually, I'm not going to fill this in because I've got no way of expressing my dissatisfaction. So really, all you're doing is you're asking a group of people who are satisfied with their service just how much they're satisfied with their service. And then this 92% that they took is all but the last two columns. So it just seems like a really terrible survey. So I came out in the Times and I commented on that and said how terrible it was. And just to finish, this is what they came back with. They said 95% of Ryanair customers haven't heard of the Royal Statistical Society. 97% that people need to book a low-fare Ryanair holiday. And this isn't even the best bit. I said that 130 million passengers fly Ryanair every year. If you take 5% of them, that's 6.5 million people. 6.5 million people have heard of the Royal Statistical Society. And I think we would be really, really happy with that. Jennifer Rogers, thank you very much.
This rather idiosyncratic use of statistics by media, do you think it's deliberate ignorance, or is it that they spin it to make a more interesting story?
I think that the culture is changing. I'm finding that I get a lot more phone calls from journalists who are wanting to do a good job. But I also think that there is a pressure from then the powers that be to produce these headlines that are shocking and that are going to make people want to read their stories or buy their newspapers. I think they are in a really difficult position. But as I said, I am starting to get more phone calls from journalists who are wanting to do a better job. It's not all journalists, but yeah, I don't think I've really answered the question. But I think it's a tough one. I think that they're under a lot of pressure, but also do want to do a good job.
This may sound flippant, but it's actually a serious question. Has anyone done any studies in correlation between reading tabloids and cancer?
Do you know what? Probably someone has done, because they'll find a relationship with everything to do with cancer. Everything gives you cancer and everything cures cancer. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone's done that. But there is a correlation-causation argument, because you could think of lots of social demographic factors that are associated maybe with people who read tabloids and lifestyle choices and things like that. You know, you could see it.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to ask is, have you looked at, when they talk about people's response to a product, sometimes I understand that this is the result of being given 3 samples of something and then saying, what did you think of it? And would you like more? So then invariably people give a good report on the product.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues in advertising, and actually, in all seriousness, my role as VP in the RSS, it is something that we're actually investigating at the moment and trying to get the regulations changed. Amazingly, you don't even have to use a representative sample. You're allowed to ask people who might view your product more favourably, but you have to declare it if you have done so. So it might be, when they say so many % of our customers say this, that would be them admitting that they're using a non-representative sample, even though it's not explicit, and I think it would be quite easy to just brush over that. So we are trying to change some of the regulations, because in all seriousness, I do think that there are a lot of things wrong with the stats that you see in adverts.
Hi, you've used a lot of p-values obviously in your talk today, and there's kind of quite a big culture shift nowadays towards getting away from p-values, and obviously they're kind of the associated issues, and I just wonder whether kind of what your approach is, whether you think you're going to continue using p-values for a long time, whether you're going to find alternate statistics in the future.
Yeah, yes, I completely get your point in that. So I work in medicine, which is where one of the biggest conversations is happening as to the use of p-values and things like that. And actually, should you be describing something as statistically significant or not? Because that's very binary and actually is a sliding scale. If you say something is significant if the p-value is less than 0.05? What's the difference between 0.51 and 0.049? Do you know what I mean? Yes, I completely take your point. I kind of use them in this because I think they're quite nice to try and just explain a concept and to try and communicate the idea of statistical significance without hopefully putting too much emphasis on it.
With the questions about correlation and causation, do you think there's any merit in taking a large data set from some random phenomenon and then applying sufficient computing power on it to see if you can draw out any relationships without any idea of what the relationship should be or how they would work?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because if you think about things like, say your Amazon purchases, and just looking at the links between people who buy this tend to buy this and all that kind of stuff, is that kind of the sort of thing that you're sort of leaning towards, without trying to think about what the mechanisms going on behind it, but actually these sorts of things just link? And I was chatting to actually a colleague in my department, and really interestingly, thinking about trying to take the ideas behind like the Amazon sort of buy-in, you know, we recommend this for you because you've bought this sort of thing, and applying it to medicine, and looking at, so every kind of medical condition's got a code associated with it, and can actually we try and use these sorts of things that say, actually, say if you're asthmatic, we recommend this as well. So not recommend, but actually can we use these kind of links? These things typically tend to happen together, and can we start building these relationships up? And I think that's potentially really interesting and potentially really powerful, but there would need to be then investigation into what is the mechanisms behind that. Can we actually, I guess, could we use those sorts of things as maybe hypothesis generating, and then use them as ways to investigate further? I think would be quite interesting.
As regards the journalists, would you not agree that journalists need training in statistics and numeracy generally to be able to understand and use figures better?
Yeah, I can quite make that.
Can't quite hear it. It's a bit
Yeah.
muffled.
But I'm suggesting that journalists, should, as part of their training in media studies and so on, they should also be trained in statistics and numeracy generally.
So should journalists be trained in numeracy and
Yes.
statistics? The RSS, again, without mentioning them again, do offer quite a lot of courses for journalists, and it is something, but I'm not sure how much we can ever enforce it and regulate against that sort of thing. I think we can just try and encourage, and actually I think I'm a really bad example, because I've just stood up here and shown you really bad examples of when journalists do wrong. I think maybe as statisticians we could be doing an awful lot more to commend when journalists get it right, and rather than being the bad guys always telling people when they've done it badly, try and actually encourage good practice. I'm not sure it's anything we could ever enforce, but I think, maybe as a profession we could be doing more to encourage good practice and reward good practice.
Okay, well, it's now time to finish. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming. We planned these things very much in advance, and so we were sure to pick a day when there wasn't a football match on. So you may have seen on your seats there's some feedback forms, so please could you fill those in so that we can improve our popular lectures, and we'll have a statistician look at it on it. And one final thing, can we please thank our speaker once more. Okay.